Please, Matteo.
Thank you, kind presentation. Thank you for the organizers. And the aim of my talk is to try to connect different domains, different biomarkers of schizophrenia vulnerability, and in particular, motor symptoms, language impairment, and self-disorders. The main idea, the main concept is that these apparently different domains actually are grounded in a common substrate based on sensorimotor connectivity. So an early disruption of multisensory and sensorimotor connectivity from the very beginning spread to different domains, from motor to language to self-disorders. So the idea is, of course, a bottom-up conceptualization based on embodiment and also language embodiment, of course. What is embodiment? We know that the core feature of schizophrenia is a profound disruption of the bodily self, implicit consciousness of one's own body, and the collapse of the bodily self expresses in a set of anomalous self-experiences, which are rooted in this disembodiment, from a diminished sense of self-presence, a blurred self-demarcation, but also tendency of hyper-reflexivity, tendency to be worried about ontological concerns, and on the other hand, don't grasp the familiar meanings of feelings. The body itself is constructed through self-embodiment processing, which in turn is based on a widespread network of multisensory and sensorimotor integration processes. So the body itself is multisensorial, relational, basically dynamic. And when we talk about multisensory integration, we talk about two main principles. Two different stimuli may be integrated within a specific space, the peripersonal space, which is the space surrounding our body, and within a specific temporal window, so a time principle. These parameters, spatial and temporal parameters, are fixed, are specific, but at the same time, they show high plastic features during development. Multisensory integration is deeply linked to sensorimotor integration. Sensor and motor are linked in order to have a matching between our expected and actual results in motor enhancement. So the multisensory integration is at the basis for motor coordination, behavioral responses, etc. And of course, multisensory integration is the scaffolding for higher cognitive abilities. There is evidence that in individuals with schizophrenia, but also in healthy individuals with high schizotypal traits, so it's a trait-like condition, there is an impairment in multisensory integration in both time and space principle. For example, in this slide, you can see an enlargement of the temporal window. So a difficulty in discriminating stimuli in these patients. And the difficulty in discriminating stimuli means a perceptive chaos in individuals with schizophrenia. The same can be said for the space principle, the peripersonal space, in individuals with schizophrenia, but also in healthy people with high schizotypal traits, we have a narrower size in peripersonal space with respect to controls. So the peripersonal space is narrow, and at the same time, there is a less defined boundaries between peripersonal space and extrapersonal space, a weaker differentiation between the peripersonal and the extrapersonal space. What is very important is that these parameters are associated with core symptom dimensions of schizophrenia, in particular negative symptoms, as well as with specific symptoms of intersubjectivity impairment in schizophrenia. Bloyer's autism, schizophrenia, autism. Most importantly, the same parameters are also associated with language production. For example, a more restricted peripersonal size is associated with a major impairment in language production, as assessed by the TLC and CLAP scores. But also a lesser peripersonal plasticity is associated with underproductivity, language underproductivity. In this slide, we can see the global level of connectedness according to Natalia Motta's model. On the left, individuals with schizophrenia, and on the right, health controls. What is very important is that the global level of speech connectivity is associated with a narrow peripersonal space size. So we have a link, a connection between the sensorimotor domain on the one hand and the language domain, language and speech production on the other hand. We have also investigated other features of language processing, for example, prosodic features and turn-taking conversational patterns, and specific parameters of both prosodic and conversational parameters are associated with negative symptoms and disorganization symptoms of schizophrenia, and also with specific self-disorders. For example, a loss of fluidity in conversation is associated with the schizophrenic tendency to spatialize the tendency to perceive thoughts as with an object-like character, as a physical object. So there is an integration, an intertwining, complex intertwining between motor symptoms, language impairment, and self-disorders. And how can we explain these complex, profound intertwinings? We have adopted an evolutionary and phenomenological framework based on the fact that schizophrenia is a uniquely human condition. Schizophrenia is absent in other close species, like great apes. There is not a real animal model for schizophrenia, for example. And we also know that the language, the evolution of language, led to a widespread neural rearrangement, connectivity rearrangement, with a global reconfiguration of structural and functional connectivity. And this was due to a widespread reuse or exploitation of the sensory motor system from cortical to subcortical levels. And this huge exploitation, adaptation of sensory motor system for language processing was favored by the fact that the sensory motor grounding is highly flexible. And sensorimotor flexibility is due to two main parameters: the context dependence. It is specific functional configurations are the result of different biocultural inputs, environmental inputs, and its intrinsic dynamicity. Novel functions emerge from the plastic modulation between the nodes of the same network. This can be seen, for example, during the process of concepts abstraction. Concepts are gradually freed from rigid neurochemical sensorimotor constraints in favor of looser connection. We can represent graphically all this stuff with a typical evolutionary cliff-edged thickness function in which we can see in the x-axis language of course leads to an increase of fitness in the human species up to the point in which a too excessive relaxation of sensorimotor grounding to unconstrained connection led to a collapse of self-embodiment processing and sensorimotor grounding. It is the classical schizophrenia disconnection from Chasleen to Bloiler, Spalto, etc. So we can see that self-embodiment processing and language processing are two poles lying on the same sensorimotor grounding, connected by what is called an evolutionary trade-off. In individuals with schizophrenia, this trade-off is unbalanced toward language, with the detriment of self-embodiment processing. So concluding, we have to search for integrated self-motor-language biomarkers of psychotic vulnerability, and we have to focus on the developmental determinants that have an impact on this sensory-motor balance during developmental years, and also their potential adaptive responses. I'd like to thank all my colleagues, and in particular, Dr. Valerio Lucarini and Francesco Magnani, who are in the crowd. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo, for this interesting presentation. We have time for questions. Wolfram.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love the big picture approach you're taking, but the intertwining you're talking about, the language and the sensorimotor processes, is not really considered a unidirectional. So it goes in both them. The shaping up of your language function will shape up your interpersonal space as well. So it's slightly bidirectional. So instead of looking at this as a sensorimotor driven disturbance of the language function, look at the language function as a hierarchical organization of your cognition, starting from sensorimotor exactly to self-generation of movement thoughts. All of that is keeping this high in place. So that's kind of the equation that I think is should easily be considered as the slightly bottom-up directed one.
I agree with you. In fact, my framework, bottom-up framework, has to be integrated with a top-down framework. I didn't show you a slide. Evolutionary, if you want, anthropological slides, in which the evolution of language occurred within specific eco-cultural niches. And within these niches, there was a circularity, of course, from motor to cognitive, and from cognitive to motor, a circularity process, a looping. driven by, of course, biocultural processes. So the picture is far more complex, of course, but we don't have to neglect the motor grounding also cognitive processing.
Time for a question. That's it. Thank you very much, first of all. Very impressive. I really enjoyed. Great body of work as well. I have two quick questions. Number one is just following up on what Wolfram said in terms of causal hypothesis. In a couple of slides, you actually showed the problems, and then you kind of displays a little bit the language, and then you have another self-experience later. Do you see a temporal progression from motor problems to language problems to self-experience? Is that what your data shows in any way?
I don't know, I don't have data if there is a progression, but we know that motor problems are in individuals at risk are very, very early because at the age of 2 years old, we still have problems with in the posture, so postural balance, and dyspraxia, childhood dyspraxia. So motor problems are very, very early, but I don't have data about a progression. We also know that specific self disorders are also very early, but I don't know.
We see now massive levels of data coming in schizophrenia. It does not do context, stage of illness, whatever it is. Speech of patients often have higher personal pronoun use. This is a phenomenon that I'm very intrigued by, and I wonder whether the personal space reduction had more relationship with pronoun use. Yeah.
If per person space is
Related to the pronoun I, patients usually in our data.
I don't have data about that. Studies about peripersonal space in the schizophrenia spectrum are at the beginning. We don't know a lot of things. For example, I didn't talk about plasticity. We expected that schizophrenia individuals had an impairment in plasticity. Instead, they are a huge plasticity. So it's very, very, very complex.
Related to Lena's question and what you're talking about, we usually normalize for the total number of words, right? When we find these increases in personal pronoun use. So if there's a decrease in the associations between I and the rest of the world, then you'll find a proportional increase in the personal pronouns. And I was going to ask also a time varying question as well. Gina and I were talking just yesterday about kind of a homeostasis kind of idea.
Yes.
I wonder if something similar could apply to what you're talking about. So not just dynamics in terms of sensory motor problems leading potentially to self and language disturbance, but also different directions of change at different phases of illness, where there's perhaps could even be an expansion of the peripersonal space in early phases of psychosis and a homeostatic restriction in order to.
Yes, we talked yesterday about the homeostatic mechanisms, probably during developmental years. We have a lot of homeostatic developmental mechanisms to counteract different multisensory integrative processing. And our lab is studying obsessive compulsive symptoms because we believe that the early onset of obsessive compulsive symptoms have the function to give an order, predictability to an underlying chaotic processing.
We have to go on. If there are other questions, please ask directly during the lunch to our speakers. Thank you very much. And now it's a pleasure to introduce to you Giorgio Di Lorenzo from Tor Vergata University in Rome, that will talk as about cognitive exercises